Okay. There we go. Okay, so I'm just going to go over some basics of digestion, and if everyone can mute themselves. There. I think everyone's, just so we don't, yeah, so we don't get like scritchy, scratchy noises in the background. So I titled both of these talks, or all three of them, Healthy Gut, Happy Life, because the gut is such a huge part of our entire system. We're going to talk mostly about the gut specifically today. So today what we're going to cover is just the basic nuts and bolts, how things work. A little discussion about food, and this is optimal system diet. So this isn't specific diets or treatment diets, or, you know, just if things are functioning well, what we should eat, how and when to keep our gut as healthy and happy as possible. A little bit of talk about gut microbes, the good ones, the bad ones, keeping them in balance, and then some little tips at the end about just improving digestion in general, just simple things that most people can do. Some of this you're probably all already doing. So these are the basics in a few words: chewing, swallowing, breaking everything down, absorbing, and eliminating. It starts in the mouth. Actually, digestion starts a little before that. So the breakdown starts a little before we start eating, but once we're chewing, and then the stomach, liver, gallbladder, and pancreas are kind of the machinery that churns everything, breaks it down, emulsifies it, gets it ready to be absorbed. And then the absorption happens mainly in the small intestine, which is the largest part of the digestive system, the longest, most surface area. And then, of course, the large intestine is what consolidates everything we don't want and gets it out of the body. This is just a basic anatomy picture. I liked that everything was just really super simple. Just gives you an idea of how things are laid out. The one thing that we're going to go back to in a few minutes, but I think is really good to notice, is just how the liver, gallbladder, pancreas, and stomach all kind of fit together into a little notch. They're all and they're much more closely intertwined than this picture makes it look like. But that'll be important in a little bit. And then, of course, the small and large intestine take up the bulk of things down there. So the actual cascade of digestion starts before we eat. A large portion of digestion starts when we think about food, when we start to feel hungry, when we look at food and smell food. So all of our senses help the brain to know that food is coming. And that's part of what turns on the stomach acid pumps. It starts to make us salivate, and salivation has enzymes in it to start to break down simple starches in the mouth. So a lot of it happens before we actually put anything in our mouths. And this is part of why when we don't take time to slow down and eat, that can mess up the whole digestive cascade. And then the vagus nerve is part of this as well. It's part of that same brain and stomach and organ system connection. When the vagus nerve is relaxed, things function a little bit better. And we're going to talk about that in a little more detail. And then stomach acid, like I said, is also started before we start eating. So you really want the stomach acid to be produced and the stomach to fill up with acid before you even eat anything. So a large portion of stomach acid should start before we even bite into anything. So this is just a look at the different pH systems. So you know that it doesn't have the mouth in it, but the mouth is similar to the esophagus. So the pH of the mouth and the esophagus is very alkaline. Water and blood are about 7, so they're pretty neutral. And then the stomach, it says 2 to 5, but really optimally the stomach should be about 2 to 3. We don't really want it to get too much higher than that. And then it goes back down to alkaline. So there's a lot of stuff that happens in here to keep things in these parameters, because you don't want acid in a place that's supposed to be alkaline. And so part of what actually protects this system is that process of thinking about our food, smelling our food, letting the system kind of get primed before we even eat, because then the stomach is really at its optimal functioning capacity. And you'll see in a minute how that has a lot to do with the entire cascade happening properly. And this is a part where stress really gets involved, that any kind of stress really can put a kink in the system. So about 20% of total acid secretion happens before any food enters the stomach. And again, that's that brain connection. It has a lot to do with the vagus nerve and our levels of stress, how tense we feel both internally and externally, how relaxed we are or aren't. And here's just a cool picture of the vagus nerve itself. You could Google vagus nerve and there's so much written about it because we know it has so many functions in the body. But you can see down, it's really big up at the top. And then as it goes down, you can see it turns into little tendrils and it goes into almost every single organ system in the body. The word vagus means wanderer. It's the 10th cranial nerve. But the importance of it for our talk today in digestion is really the stress component. That when the vagus nerve is poorly toned, and I have a slide about this for you. So when the vagus nerve is poorly toned, and this happens when we're eating and driving, running around, not taking time to sit and relax, that's a stressed out, poorly toned vagus nerve. That will slow down our digestion and the motility. It can lead to anxiety and depression, lots of insomnia, and it can create low or high blood pressure, either acutely or chronically. And if it's well-toned, meaning, you know, we're relaxed, we feel calm, we're happy, it creates much smoother digestion, good motility, so things are moving in a rhythmic, smooth way. You have an overall sense of calm and relaxation, none of that buzzing kind of anxiety. Leads to good quality sleep down the road, not directly digestion related, but important. Healthy blood pressure, not too low or too high, because both can be a problem. And healthy immune system. So the vagus nerve has a lot to do with good, happy digestion. And then once we get, so at the first part, we're getting into the stomach and we want the stomach to be nice and full of stomach acid. That's where everything is just broken down into larger pieces. In the mouth, things are chewed into larger chunks, and then in the stomach, they get a little bit smaller. And the stomach moves in a rhythmic manner, just the same way that we chew. Everything in the digestive system from the mouth all the way to the bottom moves in rhythmic waves. So the stomach acid is mixing in this rhythmic pattern with whatever you've eaten, mixing it up into this uniform ball with all the different acids and pepsin and whatever nutrients were in your food. And that ball of food from the stomach is pretty acidic. And then when it empties out right into that little region where it says descending region of the duodenum. It's that little curl that curls around the pancreas and the liver and the bile duct kind of, or the gallbladder, all tuck nicely into that little pocket. That's a really important little chunk of machinery there, because as that really acidic ball of food comes out of the stomach, it lands right into that little piece of the duodenum and it sends a message. Whatever the pH of that ball is, sends a message to the pancreas and to the liver and gallbladder and says, hey, there's fat in here, so gallbladder sends some bile in. There's some protein and some carbohydrates, so pancreas send in some enzymes. So if what comes out of the stomach isn't quite right, the pH isn't low enough, it's not going to send the proper message to the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas, and it's kind of going to mess up the whole system from there on down. So making sure you have good quality, properly timed, enough stomach acid with each meal is really a huge, huge piece. And making sure that you can minimize your stress as much around eating as possible is going to help with that. It's just going to help make the stomach acid production better. And then, so then we go into this little machinery section, which breaks it down further. So fats become emulsified, proteins get broken down further, everything gets smaller and smaller and smaller, so that when things enter into the small intestine, they're at a small enough size that they can be absorbed through all the little tiny hairs or villi that are in the small intestine. So this liver, we talked about the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas just continue to break things down. The stomach acid is important to trigger that. And then, you know, a kink in that little phase anywhere is really going to mess things up in the small intestine. If things aren't broken down enough in the small intestine, that can lead to a whole lot of symptoms. And over time, chronically, it can lead to malabsorption of nutrients and other things. So Here's another just big picture that shows everything, but it shows superimposed on top of it the small intestine. So the large intestine gets talked about a lot, and we'll get to that about all the different bugs and stuff in the large intestine, but the small intestine is actually the workhorse of the digestive system. So provided that everything above is operating pretty well, about 90% of all the nutrients in your food should be absorbed by the time they get to the end of the small intestine. So really only that 10% that's left that enters into the large intestine gets, there's small absorption there too, but it's a really efficient absorption house. It's just where all the nutrients are absorbed into the body. And they're funneled into the bloodstream and sent all over the body for various tasks. And I should mention, I forgot to mention about stomach. Well, we'll come back to that. I want to say a little thing about heartburn and reflux, but we'll get there. So the small intestine is on average, not the same for everyone, but on average it's 6 meters or 20 feet long. It's only an inch in diameter. The large intestine is much bigger in diameter, but it's shorter. It's about 5 or 6 feet. So it's huge. And all of those twists and turns and convoluted little spaces are filled with just trillions of little tiny microscopic hairs that increase the surface area even more, so that that's what makes it so efficient and effective at absorbing nutrients for us. So in addition, about 70% of our total body immune system lives in the small intestine. So all the different lymph tissue that both locally responds to, like, let's say if you ate something and got food poisoning, or you were exposed to a parasite or something, local immunity in the gut lining itself will respond to that. But then just inside the little twists and turns of the small intestine lie all kinds of little patches of lymph tissue that communicate with the bloodstream and are a huge part of our systemic immune system. And like I mentioned, 90% of all the nutrients are absorbed here in the small intestine. The small intestine is pretty clean as bacteria go. You'll see in a couple of slides that the mouth and the large intestine are much dirtier. They're much fuller of bugs. But the bacteria that do live in the small intestine live in that junction zone right where your appendix is, right before the small intestine empties into the large. And that next week, we're going to talk more about how things go wrong. And that is a very sensitive area where things do tend to go wrong. Things tend to get out of balance. And motility. So I mentioned a little bit about the rhythmic nature in which we chew, the churning of the stomach. The small intestine is the same. It's just ripples of waves that move through and help move that ball of food slowly through the small intestine. And one of the most important points about motility for the small intestine is that it needs breaks between eating. So the spaces between meals are like flushing out waves. There are little waves that happen all the time that kind of move that food along. But then there are these big rhythmic waves that happen from beginning to end of the small intestine that are flushing out waves. It's like rinsing out the sink or something. And in order for that to be triggered, there has to be spaces without food, without any major distension of the stomach. Any real big stretching of the stomach will trigger more waves all throughout the system. That is another key place in which things can go wrong, or where people can feel symptoms. So then the large intestine, and this is often the place when people talk about probiotics and prebiotics and different types of food. A lot of it is referring to the large intestine, although the small intestine also plays a part. So that part where it says ileocecal valve, appendix, and cecum, that's the spot where that's right where the small intestine empties in. And that's where things tend to get out of balance or backed up, or that ileocecal valve can be dysfunctional. But you can see it loops up and around and then back down. So it starts on your right side, goes up and over, and then circles down to the left. So the large intestine's main job, small intestine is mainly absorption. That's its biggest function, although it also helps create things. There are other things, but mainly absorption. And the large intestine is mostly just taking back all the water that was used in the mixing, breaking down, absorbing of things. Whatever water is left over is removed in the large intestine. And as you all know, I'm sure, you remove too much water and you get hard, difficult constipation. You have too much water, you get watery diarrhea. And there's lots of ways that this water balance can be affected. But that's one of the large intestine's primary goals. And then bacteria, the bacteria that live in the large intestine are so abundant, so highly variable, and they ferment all the things that we can't digest. So all the cellulose and plant matter and different types of fibers that aren't absorbable by the small intestine get fermented and broken down further into just waste products that we then pass out of our bodies. And the bugs that eat them, it's their food. So there's so many bugs in our body that we can't live without. They can't live without us. So we feed them by eating lots of different types of fiber. And then they help us get rid of things that we can't digest or utilize. There is a tiny bit of absorption that does happen in the small intestine, and certain things can get recycled in the large intestine if things aren't working properly. So different kinds of wastes and toxins, cholesterol, hormones, things that should be excreted because they're excess can sometimes be reabsorbed if there's an issue, or if things are sitting in the colon for too long, they can be reabsorbed, but not to any large degree. The large intestine is not very good at absorption. So this is just a little, all of that whole cascade from the minute things hit your stomach to when they come out the other end. This is an overview of how long that takes. And this is an average. Everybody's digestive system is going to work a little slower or faster depending on other factors. But only half of the stomach contents empty in about 2.5 or 3 hours. So the whole stomach, whatever you ate, you had burgers and fries, that burger and fries isn't going to, the whole meal won't empty out in 2.5 or 3 hours. Only about half of it will. So it goes in waves. So 4 to 5 hours for the whole thing. And that 4 to 5 hours is key to what I mentioned about motility. That's about the amount of time between meals, depending on your metabolism. About 4 hours usually that it takes for the small intestine to clean itself out. So that's the period of time you want to leave between meals to help your system clean itself out between food. And then you can see same thing with the small intestine. Even though the small intestine is 20 feet long, it still takes only about the same amount of time as half of the stomach contents from the stomach, or half of the contents from the stomach. Because the stomach has to the acid in the stomach has to break down big pieces of things, whereas the small intestine's got so much absorption capacity that it can absorb all of that in the same amount of time it takes for the stomach to empty half of its contents. I thought that was kind of cool. I pulled this out of a research study. And then the transit through the colon, I would say it's more like 24 to 48 hours, but this particular study said 30 to 40. So that's for things to get completely all the way out to the other side. But you have to remember, if you're eating 3 meals a day, it's going to go in constant succession, so you've always got something moving through all of these phases. The body's always working. The one slide I did not put in here, which just occurred to me is really important, is digestion is the one thing that requires more energy than any other function of the human body. Just the sheer amount of calories and energy it requires is pretty amazing. I wish I had a slide for you about that, but so bugs. This is, you don't have to look at the specific names. If you just kind of look at it from a little bit afar, you can see that the small intestine is that tiny little black and white box. Like there's hardly anything in there. It's relatively clean. You've got like 2 different fungal or yeast species and 3 different major classes of bacteria, and that's it. And then you look at the mouth and the large intestine, and it's huge. Even the stomach has quite a few organisms in it, and the esophagus. So we are filled with bacteria, and bacteria is a huge reason why it is the reason why we are able to eat so many different types of foods. You know, most animals out in the world don't have quite the varied diet that we do. You know, they have, a pretty select group of things that they feed on. We can eat just about anything other than leaves off a tree or grass from the ground. You know, we have a pretty varied diet, and it's because of all these bugs. So we have evolved over millennia, and as we evolve and started growing food, processing grains, each time we added a new type of food into our diet, it required that we also make friends with some kind of new bacteria to help us digest that thing. So, for example, like vegetable matter. Vegetable matter wouldn't be digestible without certain bacteria. We just aren't capable of doing it without them. And they evolved to be our friends over time because we started eating more plant matter. I just thought that was kind of cool. There are more bugs in your large intestine than there are people on the planet. And they really are, really, really are our best friends. So that brings us to, well, what makes all of these bugs happy? We know that they've evolved with us and they're here to help us digest our food, but how do we feed them to make them the happiest? And so I get this question a lot as a naturopath, like, what should I eat? How, what's the best diet? There is no single right diet for everyone, but what I'm going to talk about today is the diet that is in general best for humans if everything were working well and, functioning perfectly, and you just needed to get in the nutrients and feed the microbes what they wanted to eat. We're going to talk mostly about that. But the diets that I use with patients is a whole different story, and we're going to talk more about that next week because we're going to talk about how all these things go wrong and what we can do about them. And that's when specific diets come in handy for specific people. But really, the health or not health of the gut is what should determine what we eat. So I'm going to skip the what to eat first. We're going to come back to that. We're going to talk first about when and how, because those are a little bit easier and often don't get talked about. So going back to that vagus nerve piece about wanting your parasympathetic nervous system, that part of us that's relaxed and allows digestion to happen naturally, because it's an automatic process that we don't have to think about or do anything about. We want to eat when the vagus nerve is well toned, when it's relaxed. And one of the ways to do that is to eat with other people. So eating alone and eating quickly on the run doesn't allow the vagus nerve or the nervous system time to really sink into that parasympathetic mode. So chewing slowly and well, eating with others, because it slows us down. You're often talking to people when you eat with others, so you take more time between bites. Consciously eating, meaning, take a minute to really look at your food, smell your food, enjoy it before you even taste it. That triggers the whole brain connection with the stomach. Also helps to get us into that mode of, okay, we're about to eat. Drink water with your food. This is a controversial thing. Some people say you shouldn't dilute your stomach acid. And again, this is if things are healthy. You want to have a little bit of liquid, about 2/3 to 1/3, depending on how thirsty you are in general. But having a little bit of water to mix with the dryness of food that you have to chew is helpful, unless, of course, you're just eating soup or something. And then eating at regular times to fit in with those waves that we talked about. So the waves of the stomach, releasing half the contents and then the other half, and then going into the small intestine, and then leaving time between meals. So trying to eat meals at the same time each day. This is a really hard one for people, and me included. But regularity of meals, leaving time between meals, about 3 to 4 hours, depending on your appetite, without snacking, and thing after dinner. And eating within an hour to two, I should say, depending what you do in the morning when you wake up. Eating within an hour to 2 hours of waking up feeds your hormonal system. The hormonal system of cortisol and melatonin, adrenal and thyroid hormones, is on a fixed time clock with the sun. And when we wake up, the body instantly thinks, okay, it's ready to go. And part of what it needs is fuel for that. And when you wait long periods to eat in the morning, like 3, 4, 5 hours, the body just kind of says, oh, okay, I must have been wrong. I'm going to go back into sleep, down regulating slow mode, because everything goes into super slow mode when we sleep because there's no activity happening. And there's no energy being spent to digest. It's being used for other things. So it sort of triggers the system, and it's a response to what the body is physiologically wanting hormonally at that period of time. That helps with energy, metabolism, and just regulating digestion. And then leaving the time between meals, and really only snacking when you're hungry. And I know with all the quarantine lately, I've heard from everyone that that's been so hard because it's so boring being at home all the time that, everyone's just, me too, like just keeping snacks, or you get bored and you walk into the kitchen and look in the refrigerator. Like it is hard to do right now. This also these are things we'll talk about at the end. Again, I'll kind of review this, but these are things that almost everyone can do, even if there's just something a little off, or you just want to tone things up. These are really simple things you can do. And sometimes this is enough to get things back into balance. And then as far as what to eat, variety is the key. Variety of vegetables, variety of proteins. Try not to eat the same thing every day. Don't eat the same thing for breakfast every day, because we're trying to get we're designed to eat a wide variety of things because we need a whole lot of different nutrients, and we get those nutrients from different things, plants, animals, legumes, fruit. I mean, so many different things in our diet that you want to think about a balanced diet over the course of a month, not a day. So you want to try and get as much variety over the course of a month that you can. Or at least that's the way I like to think about it. Sometimes people feel like they have to be perfect every day or every week. And if you think about it more of getting lots of variety in over the course of a month, it's a little bit more manageable. Vegetables are super important. And we're going to look at an updated pyramid, a food pyramid that I found on the internet. There's some things I don't love about it, but the base of the pyramid is vegetables, cooked vegetables primarily, protein, healthy fats, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about what these things mean in a minute. Organic and clean food, of course, as much as possible, because you all know we live in a toxic world, and the less toxins we can put into our body, the better. And then sugar really is the worst thing for us. There's all kinds of things out there. Doesn't mean you shouldn't ever have something sweet, but just in the general scheme of things, people often ask me about, cholesterol or meat fat, or different types of fats, and those are really, if you're eating good quality food, those are really way less of a danger than sugar. Sugar creates a lot of inflammation in the body, especially processed white sugar, but depending on your system, everybody's system is a little bit more or less sensitive. That can include other types of sweet things, but sugar is much more of a risk factor than anything else in our diet. So there's also the discussion of cooked versus raw foods. Ideally, again, if the system is healthy, you want to eat a little bit of everything. Our teeth and jaws and digestive systems are designed to be omnivorous. We're designed to eat a whole lot of different things. It just looks like I lost everybody.
No?
No? Oh. Okay. I just suddenly lost everybody's pictures, but okay. So this question really is a person-specific thing, but I have noticed, I've only lived in California a year, and I moved here from Maine, so very, very different places. And I noticed when I moved here that a lot of people are really into raw foods and salads. And I treat mostly digestive dysfunction. That's kind of my primary thing. And so in that case, raw food is really hard on the body. So depending where you're at digestively, you should eat a little bit of both, but I think there's often more of an emphasis on raw foods because salads are easy to grab. But because the cellulose is intact and hasn't been broken down, it requires a lot more energy to break down. So if your system is challenged at all, it's going to be harder. It is literally cold, so the system's going to have to warm it up. It's the same thing with drinking ice water. The body has to warm it up, which requires more energy and effort. And many of the nutrients in raw plant material are not as bioavailable. So a lot of, even though, a vegetable might be high in some key nutrient, that nutrient may not be as available to the body, just because of the way our systems are designed to absorb things. So again, depending where you fall on the spectrum, and how healthy your digestive system is, warm food is more soothing to the vagus nerve. There's no extra energy required. Things are already partially broken down, so they're easier to digest. They are still very fiber rich. There's also, I've heard a few people tell me at least that, they think raw food is higher in fiber. And that's not really true. Plant matter in general, regardless of whether it's cooked or not, is high in fiber, and various types of fiber, not just one or the other, both soluble and insoluble. And most of the time, the nutrients are just more bioavailable. They're just easier for us to digest. So vegetables, definitely the cornerstone of the human diet. And I think myself included, it's the thing that I could always eat a whole lot more of. And again, cooked, raw, a little bit of everything. There are certain vegetables that should never be eaten raw, like Swiss chard and kale and broccoli. They're just much, much better for you cooked, and they can actually do things to our thyroid gland that aren't great. And they're, like I mentioned, they're a good source of fiber. So really, when people ask me, what can I do that's good for me, and they just want to make one change, I always say, add more vegetables to your diet. Because I have to remind myself of that all the time too. Meat is another question I get a lot, like to eat meat or not. We're designed to eat meat. We've been eating meat and nuts and berries and stuff probably longer than anything else that we ingest. So our bodies are pretty good at getting nutrients out of animal products. They're nutrient dense, so the nutrients are just more packed per square inch. You get kind of more bang for your buck. So if you are nutrient depleted, it's a better choice. They're typically less allergenic than grains, and not vegetables, but other plant matter like grains particularly have a potential to be allergic or allergenic. We don't need as many bacteria in the gut to digest meat because we've evolved eating meat for so long. There are other reasons a human body may not digest animal protein well, and that usually has more to do with the stomach and messing up that whole cascade at the beginning. And depending on the sources of meat, they're really good source. Animal products, particularly meat and dairy, but particularly meat, are a good source of omega fatty acids, protein, and all kinds of different vitamins. Grains are also good sources of different types of fiber, vitamins. We do need good bacteria to help us digest anything from the plant world. So grains are one of those things that when your system isn't quite as healthy can be a little tougher on the body in a whole lot of ways. And there's variable caloric need depending on metabolism and age. And, we get quick glucose from grains. And some people, like if you're an athlete, you need more carbohydrates and you need more whole grains in your diet. When you're talking about grains, whole grains are definitely better than processed. So anything that's been ground up and turned into flour is going to produce a higher flux in blood sugar. And it's going to tend to feed the bad bacteria if there are any. And it's just not as nutrient dense. So when grains are concerned, it's always better to go for whole grains when possible. Even beautiful, fluffy jasmine rice, like I put in the picture, which was one of my favorites. And then fats. Fats are also another really, really important part of the diet that is very confusing to people. The brain and the nervous system absolutely need fat for survival, particularly in children, but also in adults. Really important for brain health, really important for hormonal health. We treat a lot of infertility in our office, and low cholesterol and improper fats in the diet can really add to infertility problems. It helps keep all of our hormones healthy, but for us women, particularly female hormones, helps keep us full so our blood sugar stays in balance. We don't get those yucky highs and lows. Fat is what our cell membranes are made of in the entire body. They're made of phospholipids. And in order to make healthy cell membranes, you need to have healthy fats. They also make up the exterior sheaths of all the nerves in the body. So I'm sure you've heard, like with MS, the myelin sheath is destroyed. That sheath is made of a large portion of fats. And then, of course, there's quality. There's good and bad fats. And when it comes to animal products in general, whether it's fat, well, or plant matter in this case, but meat and oils are really important quality, and it's much more important to get very good quality because they can carry toxins, just like our own fat cells in our bodies can harbor toxins. Fats from other things, be they plant or animal, can also harbor toxins. So you definitely want to choose good quality. And I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about what is a good fat and what's a bad fat. Ah, there it is. So you want to eat the anti-inflammatory ones and avoid the ones that increase inflammation. So there are two pathways in the body. There's the pro-inflammatory and there's the anti-inflammatory. In our Western diet, we tend to just have more vegetable oils in our diet. Like if you look at a box of any kind of snack crackers, they usually have safflower or sunflower or some sort of vegetable oil. I know most of my patients and friends and myself, like we don't eat a whole lot of hydrogenated oil. Some of these things are no-brainer. Nobody buys soy oil, but they are in a lot of packaged foods, even some of the healthy packaged foods, and they tend to drive a pro-inflammatory pathway, which is bad for all of us, but it's even worse if you do have some sort of chronic inflammatory condition. And then the things that tend to be anti-inflammatory are ghee, which was what my fat picture was of, homemade ghee, from grass-fed butter. So grass-fed butter and grass-fed beef, in general, meat, are as high in omega-3 fatty acids as deep water fish without all the mercury. So grass-fed butter and ghee are a really good source, and they're at the top of the list on purpose because they're my favorites. They're really good for the brain. They nourish the cells and the lining of the small intestine. They taste delicious. And then there's coconut oil and butter. Coconut oil is a good oil, but it can also cause problems, especially when there is yeast overgrowth in the gut. It can wipe away biofilms, which is actually a good thing, but it can cause some aggravation of symptoms. So I had a patient recently who told me that he could never eat curry because the coconut milk bothered him and he thought he was allergic. And we found out he really just had super high yeast overgrowth. And every time he would eat any coconut product, oil, coconut milk, it was causing a bunch of yeast to come out of hiding, basically. And he would get these horrible flare-ups. So just be wary. But it is a good oil to cook things in and to bake with. It's very cold in nature. So if you tend to be chilled easily and cold-blooded, it can be a little too cold for people like that. Olive oil is great as long as it's not heated too much. It's a monounsaturated oil, so it can go either way with the inflammatory or not, but in general, it's supportive, especially of cellular health. And then, of course, the fat that comes on meat, I'm not saying buying lard, although you could do that too, but the fat that actually comes on any meat that you buy, provided it's good quality meat, is also really good for particularly the brain. All right. So those are kind of the general categories, and I'm sure we'll have questions about that at the end. But then things that you want to kind of limit, and the one on here that's probably the most controversial is fruit, actually. I realized when I was putting that on there that might seem a little strange, but let me qualify that. The others are fairly obvious, I think. Alcohol turns into sugar. And remember, this diet, we're talking about what's the healthiest for the microbiome, what's going to feed all of those bugs and make them happy and allow them to help us digest food. So alcohol turns into sugar. It's pro-inflammatory. It's very heating. If you have a healthy system, it's, in moderation, probably not a problem. If your system is a little more inflamed, you might notice you have more problems with alcohol. So that's why it says sparingly, not avoid entirely. Plus, it's fun. And yeah, we have to remember enjoyment of food is also a big part of this. Sugar, as I mentioned, one of the biggest inflammatory molecules and something we don't actually need in our diets. Um, Processed carbohydrates as well. Again, snack foods. Everybody has their favorite carby snack that they love, but these are things that shouldn't make up the bulk of our diet. They should be, third tier up. And then fruit, most conventional food pyramids and stuff that you look at will just say fruit and vegetables. But the thing about fruit is it is high in fructose, which isn't necessarily bad. All fruit is different. Some are higher in fiber, but fruit ferments faster than anything else you might eat it with. And so it's best to eat it away from other foods as a snack on its own. So no mixing fruit into salads. That's actually the worst. Raw fruit and raw vegetables together tends to cause a lot of irritation and gas because the fruit ferments first, creates sugar and then ferments, and the rest of the plant matter hasn't digested, and it causes this backup that can also be really uncomfortable. So if you're going to eat raw fruit, just plain fresh raw fruit, it's best to do it alone. The other thing a lot of people do often is green smoothies with fruit. Definitely not something that's very good for the digestive system. That combination is just really hard to digest. But cooked fruit is a different story. So if you're cooking something into food, like dried fruit cooked into hot cereal, or I don't know, any sort of fresh fruit cooked, that's different. That's digested differently. The sugars are broken down differently, and it's not going to ferment as readily as fresh fruit. This is more of an issue with kids. Like I find that my patients who are parents often say, the only thing their kids want to eat is toast and fruit. And that can be hard to break once it's been started. So the earlier you can start kids in this pyramid, mostly vegetables, and of course the whole family has to do it, not just the kids. I stole this from Mark Hyman. He's a medical doctor. I think he's a gut specialist. This is his creation, and I hate the name of it. He calls it the Pegan pyramid, as in paleo and vegan combined, but that's not even really a thing. Like those are so polar opposite. But I do like the balance of things that he mentions, non-starchy vegetable plant foods as the base, meaning green things primarily, and cauliflower, that sort of stuff. And then fats and proteins in the middle. So that forms the bulk of your diet. And then starchy vegetables, squash and beets and carrots and sweet potatoes. Regular potatoes too, I think are fine. Fruits, he does put in there, you see in a small little circle or small little square, that are mostly berries, low glycemic things, things with higher in fiber. I would say apples as well, and apples cooked. And then everything else, beans, legumes, non-gluten containing grains, spices, herbs, and then all the recreational stuff at the top. So this to me gives it kind of a visual sense of quantities, like really the base of a good healthy human diet that's going to feed the microbes in a good way is going to be fat, protein, and vegetables. And then the balance of calories will be dependent on the person. And then just a little word about fiber and pre and probiotics, because this is a question I get a lot. Like, should I take probiotics? Shouldn't I? What kind of probiotics should I take? What are prebiotics? What does fiber do? So fiber is a prebiotic of sorts because it feeds good bacteria. So prebiotic just means something that feeds bacteria. And that sounds like a good thing, right? Typically, that's a good thing. We want to eat a diet, like we just talked about. We want to have a diet that's basically feeding these bugs what they want so that they're happy. And that's the same thing that prebiotics do. The risk with prebiotics, if you do have some sort of undiagnosed imbalance in your gut, is that they feed everything. They're going to feed the good and the bad. But if you've gone through gut treatment and you did have some imbalance and you corrected it, in the rebuilding phase, they can really help to rebuild a good colony of good bacteria. But they can be aggravating, and that's often a key if someone's not quite sure what's going on with their gut and they say, every time I take probiotics, or especially if they have prebiotics, I get bloated or I feel gross. That's probably a sign that there's an imbalance, and those prebiotics and maybe probiotics are feeding the bad guys. probiotics are just the bugs themselves. So it's just replenishing what should be there. And if you look at labels of probiotics, they're mind-boggling. Some have 2 strains, some have 15, some have 5. They're all over the map. If you remember from that slide before about just how many bugs we have in our gut, that's why the probiotics are so all over the map, because there are so many different types. So in a healthy gut, a great way to get probiotics is foods, and primarily through sauerkraut, kimchi, fermented vegetables. Yogurt and fermented dairy products, unless you make them yourself and you actually ferment them for a full 24 hours, they're not really very high in probiotics. And if there is a gut issue, dairy products can be aggravating, because any imbalance will tend to destroy our lactase enzyme, and the inflammation in the gut will make us more intolerant to dairy. So probiotics in foods are more accessible through things like sauerkraut. And then things like kombucha and the Kavita drinks and all of those different probiotic drinks, those are different types. Like kefir is actually a combo of a yeast and a probiotic. And some people tolerate it well. It's one of those things that if someone has a gut imbalance, those things will often make them feel worse. So you just kind of have to see how how they work for you. Probiotic supplements can definitely be useful. I tend to use them when I'm treating people at the tail end of treatment to replenish. Of course, around antibiotics, my rule of thumb is always, 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 if you're taking antibiotics, take probiotics simultaneously, obviously not right at the same time, but alternating, and then for at least a month or 2 or 3 after. The different strains of probiotics are for different things, and a lot of the stool tests out there will show us what we're depleted in and what we might have too much of. But they all do different things, and I don't even think we really know all of this yet. We know a couple of them, but like I mentioned before, certain good bugs we evolved with simply to help us digest plant matter. And there's all kinds of bugs in there that do really specific things that we don't really even understand yet. And just like prebiotics, probiotics can be aggravating, and that usually happens when there's a bacterial overgrowth in general. And then you're just sort of adding to the pile of too much. So even too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. And then fiber in general, part of the reason, the diet that I went over, when you have good proteins and lots of vegetables in your diet and some whole grains, that's going to give you all the fiber, all the different types of fiber, all the different soluble, all the different insoluble, lots of variety. And that's going to lead to more variety and diversity in your gut flora, which is what you want. They say that everyone's gut flora is kind of unique to them soon after birth, and that's pretty stable throughout our lives, although we deplete it by doing a lot of things. And so we can't really change the fingerprint nature of our microbiome, but we can feed what's there. And so getting a nice, good variety of fibers is important. And not all fiber is equal, and this has more to do with when things are out of balance. Certain types of fiber are better for certain types of conditions, and we'll talk about that more next week when we talk about IBS and Crohn's and various diagnoses. So fiber also can be aggravating. So the big take home of any of these is if it aggravates you in any way, it probably means there's an imbalance and you should get it checked out. And then just some last little wrap up, just a couple little tips and tricks of like supplements and things that you can do, that anyone can do to improve the whole cascade that we talked about. So bitters or raw apple cider vinegar before every meal. It has to be the raw kind. And it's a tiny, tiny, tiny amount. And this has to do with that vagus nerve, mind, stomach connection. It's not so much about the fact that vinegar is acidic. It's that both sour things and bitter things make us salivate. Like if you just think right now about licking a lemon, it'll make you like, ugh, you can feel it in your salivary glands. That tells the brain that food is coming and to turn on the stomach acid pumps. So I make bitters for my patients a lot because I think most commercial bitters are just not bitter enough. They try to make them taste good, and bitters shouldn't taste good. But it's tiny dosing, 5 to 10 drops on the tongue before every meal, just so you feel that bitterness and then you rinse it down, wait 15 minutes, helps prep the stomach acid pumps. And with apple cider vinegar, same thing, small amount, half a teaspoon to a teaspoon in just enough water that it tastes sour, but it doesn't burn your mouth. Because vinegar can also destroy the enamel on your teeth. So you don't really want to swish it around or make it too strong. And I usually let people choose. Do you prefer sour? Or do you prefer bitter? I like bitters better, but everyone kind of has their preference. You can also use this if you do have any heartburn or reflux. So this is what I wanted to mention about the stomach. There's a lot of misunderstanding about heartburn and reflux, and we'll talk about this more next week, but it's typically because of low or improperly timed stomach acid. The stomach acid isn't filling up before you eat, it's happening after you eat or between meals. And this simple bitters and raw apple cider vinegar, or one or the other, will help reconnect that system so that at least if that's part of the problem, this will help correct it. Often there's more going on than that, but this is a simple thing that can help. And then drinking 8 to 12 ounces of warm or room temperature water right away when you get up, or more, could even be 16 ounces, but at least 8 to 12. You can even put a few slices of fresh ginger. You can put a little squeeze of lemon. That helps flush out all the waste products from the night. Your body's been getting rid of toxins and cleaning things out, basically cleaning house while you sleep. It also starts to prime your stomach and kind of prep your body. That's a great thing to do first thing in the morning. And then digestive enzymes and HCl can be useful as a diagnostic. I don't tend to give them to people all the time. If people have some sort of really long-term chronic gut dysfunction, they can be very helpful in the short term to relieve discomfort and help people digest better. But you don't want to take them forever because they will mess up that whole system we talked about at the beginning, the whole symphony between your stomach acid and the pancreas and the liver and gallbladder. We really want that system to do its thing, to produce enough HCl, to produce enough pancreatic enzymes, to produce enough bile. And if it isn't doing that, then in the short term, or if you know you're going to have a huge meal like Thanksgiving or something, then yes, take some HCl, take some digestive enzymes. It's going to help you break things down more efficiently and faster. It's not going to help you with overeating. Overeating is just overeating and it's going to make you feel bad. But they can help in the short term, but it's not something I would suggest doing as a fix. It's an aid. And then just like we talked about regularity of meals, the other thing is no sugar or alcohol or food after 7 p.m. So just like leaving 4 to 5 hours between meals during the day, you also want to leave 3 to 4 hours between dinner and sleeping, because that is the period of time where your body's starting to go into slow mode. It's starting to get out of that high energy metabolism digestion mode, and it's going into detox and cleanup mode. And if you're putting high sugar things, that's going to stimulate the liver. And any food you're asking your body to digest is going to just turn the whole system back on. And we really want the system to be in rest mode. This is particularly important if people have any issue with sleep, any type of insomnia, falling asleep, staying asleep. This is a really good practice, just a good life practice, but especially with sleep issues. And I think, so I think that's all I had for today, but I did want to just do a little brief prep of what's going to come up next week. So this was sort of today just talking about the ways in which things work when they work well. And so next week we're going to talk about all the things that can go wrong, and there are way more than I can cover in an hour, but we're going to go over the basics, how to recognize when that's happening. Surprisingly, a lot of people don't notice that they have a gut imbalance because their symptoms are subtle, or maybe they're feeling their symptoms in another part of the body. So that's another thing, how our gut health impacts the rest of the body. Particularly for women, it can really affect our hormonal health, our sleep, so many other things, chronic pain, joint issues. A big one that I get all the time is hair loss and skin and nail issues. And then we'll talk a little bit about what to do when you do figure out that there's an imbalance, some different testing and treatment options. And then leading into the cleanse part of this, we're going to talk about, how you kind of have a sense of how digestion should work when it's happy. You'll have an idea of how things can go wrong and what to do about it. And then also get a sense of, will cleansing help you with your particular situation? And then the third talk is going to be about cleansing itself. But a lot of cleansing is deciding what type of cleanse, and is cleansing the thing to do now. Cleansing is very helpful for the intestines, the liver. It gives the body a rest. But deciding when and how to do it, we'll talk about that a little bit next week. So that is it. That's all I had for today. You guys all have my email address, but there it is again. And I am going to stop this.